Unlocking the Power of CEE and Africa in Collaboration. Let me introduce our special guest today, Hangvi Mwambadzi, founder and managing director of Nakia Venture, which is investor in Africa and consulting company. Welcome. Our special guest today is also Bolek Stawicki, senior advisor, board member, African Development Bank Group. This is a leading development finance institution in Africa. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I would like to welcome David McNair, Executive Director, Global Policy, D1 Campaign. And as you described, your organization fights for a more equal future. Welcome. And my first question is about mutual need. Why Africa and CEE must collaborate? What is your view?
Okay, let me go first. I think it's a great question, and of course, in a globalizing economy, in a globalizing reality, increased and strengthened collaboration is a natural thing. And I think one of the main reasons why these two particular regions should strengthen their collaboration is the fact that Africa is going through a dynamic phase of development, which to a great extent is driven by innovation. Innovation across various sectors, such as financial institutions, financial products, which increase access to finance. And I think that CEE has gone through, and indeed still goes through, a similar process, which is also driven by innovation. So I think there is a lot of potential exchange of knowledge and experience, as well as insights that could be mutually beneficial. So I think that would be one of the reasons why these two regions should collaborate in a sort of more profound way.
Thank you. Similar process driven by innovation. Sounds good. Please, what is your opinion?
I think there are quite a lot of similarities between the two regions, right? When you dig into some sort of the cultural components, some of the language components. So Africa is a very diverse continent in that sense. It is multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple perspectives, multiple policies, etc. And when you look into the CEE region as well, you find that there's a similar sort of diversity of cultures and equally sort of challenges and opportunities that come out of that diversity. I completely agree that there's opportunities of mutual learning across these two regions. I am mostly from a tech background and space, so we invest across tech startups across Africa. I've invested as well in the past in a company in Estonia, a tech company in Estonia, and I was completely wowed by just the development and how advanced that tech ecosystem was for a country that is an economy that is relatively small within the EU. And I started looking as well into some lessons in terms of like what could we take out from what startups in a country like Estonia have been able to achieve, and how do we leverage some of those lessons and extrapolate some of them into various African countries. So I think there are definitely opportunities to sort of leverage off each other's learnings and experience and cross-pollinate that knowledge across the ecosystems.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. So last year I published a book, a collection of essays called Why Europe Needs Africa. And really what I wanted to do was kind of flip on its head the kind of perception that Europe is more advanced or that it has more wealth or more capital or whatever. I think the reason why Europe needs Africa and why this partnership should be strengthened is threefold. The first is demography. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African. And by then, the African continent will have added about 800 million people to the global workforce. At the same time, Europe's workforce will have declined by 200 or by 150 million. So there's a kind of massive opportunity there. McKinsey puts the kind of consumer economy estimates by that period of about 3 trillion a year. So there's massive opportunities for trade, for investment, for mutual pursuing of prosperity. The second is culture. And what we're seeing now is that African cultural leaders are really kind of taking over the global space. A few years ago, a friend of mine who's a a senior figure in the music industry. He set up a Nigerian music label, and lots of people were asking him, why are you doing that? And that music label has taken off. Its artists, the Afrobeats artists, are now selling out Madison Square Garden, Wembley Stadium. They're winning Grammys. And he recently sold the label to Universal Music for a handsome sum. The third reason is climate. And there's a lot of talk, I think, about the African continent when it comes to climate as a victim. And to some extent that is true. It's responsible for 4% of historical emissions. But it's also on the front line of the climate crisis. And I think there's something really interesting about the innovations that are happening there, and the business opportunities that Africa could present. I was at the Africa Climate Summit hosted by the Kenyan President William Ruto a couple of years ago, and his vision for that was that Africa has climate solutions for the world, and there are opportunities for problem solving, for addressing energy issues with 60% of the world's solar potential, critical minerals, the best location in the world for carbon capture and storage. So there's just huge opportunities, and I think we need to kind of flip our perceptions around what the relationship can be and should be, because as you've said, the innovation, the potential is just massive.
Let's highlight there are mutual benefits for Africa, for CEE. Yeah, you agree? Or you would like anything to add concerning benefits? I mean, it's opportunity definitely to share experience, for instance, because transition, well, I must say in Poland, transition is our reality, really. Energy transition or whatever you want. And the same in Africa. So we feel that we have something to share.
I think that's true. And there are so many commonalities. In a sense, what Africa's ambition now is in terms of the African continental free trade area is kind of what Europe did in terms of creating a common market, in terms of investing in regions that were underdeveloped and bringing them into trade partnerships to boost their prosperity. That's, the lived experience of, I come from Ireland, that's my experience, that's the experience in Poland. And I think there's a lot of lessons that can be shared there, but also lots of mutual self-interest particularly because of this demographic issue. I think, but it's a natural thing that young people bring dynamism and ideas. And it's a reality that Europe's getting older and Africa is the youngest continent on the planet.
Yeah, that's true. So what about opportunities? Explore key opportunities for cooperation, priority sectors, and so on, please.
Given, obviously, I'll be speaking from my own experience and the field and the sectors that I've been working with across Africa. Some of the rather obvious areas of collaboration would be those that represent a great opportunity for the African continent, for African governments and African economies, and that would be agriculture, for example. We shouldn't forget that a vast majority of the African workforce is smallholder farmers. So this is one area, one sector where there is a great degree of opportunity to introduce innovations to make African agriculture more efficient, more productive, and to increase the wealth of hundreds of millions of Africans, because this is what they do today, this is where they work. As we know, agriculture across many CEE countries has been a major sector, a major industry, and indeed an industry that has gone through considerable changes, reforms, and transitions. So I think that is one area where the two regions could collaborate, not least when it comes to knowledge exchange, but also transfer of technologies and relevant application of those technologies in the African context. So I think that is one area. Then, of course, when we look at the energy transition that you mentioned, that Poland, for example, is going through right now, and the decarbonization process, again, this is an area which is of great importance to the African continent. We see a number of very substantial investments in green energy. So this is certainly something that is very high up on the agenda of most African governments, and there is also political commitment from African governments to increase the share of renewable energy in their energy mix today. So I would say these are two quite natural sectors around which the two regions could collaborate. Thanks.
Thank you.
Perhaps one more to add to that. I've come across quite a lot of collaboration that has already begun between the two regions when it comes to talent. So you find that a lot of African tech startups are hiring out of Central and Eastern Europe, and vice versa. So a lot of these tech companies are looking into Africa as a massive talent pool, owing largely to our young, innovative, spontaneously growing sort of young population in Africa, and the opportunities that provides for developing mass global talent. I think it is one of those, and it's actually quite interesting that there were a number of tech startups that were invested in that had engineers that were coming out of Central and Eastern Europe, and it has become a trend in the last couple of years, in fact. So on the back of that, I think also what you alluded to around technology is also an area where I think there is mass potential for shared collaboration and opportunity in terms of how do we amplify in both these regions. There are a number of tech startups that are also actively solving for problems in the African context coming out of CEE and vice versa, because I think of the shared similarities in some of those ecosystems. You find that the problem statements that they're solving for in one tend to also apply in part to another region. So that technology becomes easier to transfer from a solution perspective across the two regions. And another area which you touched on as well, I think, is culture. I've heard some of the most incredible, I think it was a Ukrainian rap artist who was on the backtrack of an Afrobeat song, and I was like, this is magic, right? And I was like, we need more of this, right? It's beautiful to see that overlap in culture and how that gets diversified through these sort of initiatives, starting labels and bringing in other parts of the world into that collaboration.
Thank you. There's not much that I can add to the kind of sectoral discussion, but just taking a kind of more macro picture, I think we are entering an era of real geopolitical volatility, and the tensions between the two major superpowers, US and China, are not going away. In fact, they may exacerbate, and that leaves the two regions in the middle, in a sense, Europe and Africa. Like, we need to navigate this, and it's best if we can navigate that together. So I think one opportunity is, certainly in my work, and we do a lot of campaigning and advocacy work with public policy, governments, major institutions. We're seeing that there is a renewed power and self-confidence among African governments to say, this is what we need, this is what we want. And because of this kind of emerging tension between the two superpowers and the two poles of power, there's a real kind of leverage that African governments have. The second thing is on the G20. So last year, the African Union was granted a permanent seat at the G20. This year, South Africa is chairing the G20, the first time an African country has done so. And I think there's major opportunities to address some of the barriers to some of these opportunities, one of which is the cost of capital, both sovereign borrowing and investment. And there's a whole debate around the way in which credit rating agencies rate African countries, the paucity of data that they have to access. There's some accusations among some of bias, although there are other views on that. But I think a big opportunity with the G20 is to kind of really tackle this issue, because if you look even at the sovereign debt, African countries will pay about 88 billion in debt service this year. Half of that is to private creditors at very high rates. So if you could bring that down even a little bit, it could unlock so much for investment in infrastructure, in health, in education, in human capital. The other part of this, and this gets to your point about the Ukrainian rapper rapping over Afrobeats, if we want those kinds of collaborations and value addition from creatives, they need to be in the same place. And tackling the visa issue is a fundamentally important issue. There's so much frustration among African business people, artists, and so on, that they apply for visas, even temporary visas in Europe, and have to pay the money, get rejected, don't get the money back. And we really need to kind of resolve that issue. It's a tricky one in Europe because of the politics is, in a sense, is going in the opposite direction in some countries. But if we want to really harness this potential, this is really a low-hanging fruit. To reduce the bureaucratic burden, reduce the costs, and just make it easier for people to get together and collaborate, start businesses, make music, make films. It's a win-win.
Definitely, this is the problem. You mentioned visa. Yeah, I would like to ask you about challenges and obstacles, but first maybe I build a bridge between opportunities and challenges. According to latest report, Africa Outlook 2025, made by Economist Intelligence Unit, Africa will be home to most of the world's fastest growing economies in 2025. But there is a risk of disruption linked to large-scale protests and demonstrations. But, well, coming back to collaboration, what are challenges and obstacles? What is the list?
I think it's very timely that you mention the report which was very recently published by The Economist. When it comes to protests and civil or social unrest, we do know that Africa has a huge youth bulge. The youth demographics that you also alluded to, David, it's potentially a problem. It's a challenge for the governments, but equally it's also an opportunity. And I think one of the challenges that most African governments face is how to tackle this challenge of youth employment. So this is one area which is also very high on the agenda. And again, the governments are trying various innovative approaches to engage in a sort of financially viable and meaningful ways the youth population of Africa, and that could be a challenge if it is not tackled properly. A political challenge, a social challenge, as well as an economic challenge for the continent. You also mentioned the fastest growing economies, most of them in 2025 being African economies. I think there is a lot of potential to be unlocked through improvements to the environment, to the sort of regulatory framework in many countries, because by doing so we can really unlock a lot of potential that there is in various countries across Africa. So an increasing number of governments would look at deregulation, would look at improving the sort of conducive environment, the business environment, reducing the red tape, introducing the free trade area, for example, which is being ratified by an increasing number of governments in Africa. So there is a lot of potential, and governments have a very important role to play to unlock that potential through smart policy making, through evidence-based policy making. Because, as you pointed out, David, I think the potential is huge. It just has to be unlocked through good governance and smart policy making, which makes regulations more predictable, more transparent, and easier to navigate for the businesses. So that is certainly an opportunity that has to be seized by the governments across Africa.
Well, frankly, in CEE we also have problem with, regulations, stable regulations. Yes, this is the problem. Maybe it's one more similarity. Maybe it's because of transition, but yes, we have it. And any more obstacles that we should mention, challenges? What is your opinion?
I think from a challenge, I mean, there are many that you could highlight in terms of challenges, but when you look at it and flip it over, sometimes you also see them as opportunities, right? I think some of the challenges that exist, not just from a collaboration perspective, I think are inherent to sort of the internal dynamics of the ecosystems in the countries that you're talking about. So yes, we talk about some of the friction from a regulatory perspective in terms of how then do European countries interact with African countries and so forth. But in some cases, we're still trying to just solve that within Africa, right? How do we interact with ourselves as countries? I know some of these challenges are looking to be addressed by the free trade agreement, which has been in the works for some time now. And I believe that I think once we get to a point where there is enough buy-in and enough implementation that some of these challenges can be overcome. There's definitely, I mean, the visa thing from a Africa to Europe perspective, it's wild that I still can't get into some African countries as an African myself on an African passport, right? I'm from South Africa, and there's some African countries where I still need to apply for visas, and it is a process, right? It is sometimes almost harder to travel across Africa and within Africa than it is actually to move from Africa to Europe, right? So there are things that we need to address and solve for internally as well within the Africa ecosystem for us to be able to come from a position of strength to say, all right, how do we then sort of better collaborate outside? Are we collaborating well within ourselves as well? Or is the focus just on external sort of extra or outside of Africa?
I would say, I would kind of categorize it in three ways. There are the barriers that can be addressed by a national government and its ecosystem. There are barriers that can be addressed at a regional level, particularly a kind of Pan-African level. And then there are barriers that need mutual collaboration internationally. And I think you've talked about both of the first two. But when it comes to like international cooperation, I really saw this. We worked very closely in my organization, the One Campaign, with African finance ministers just after COVID. And COVID was a real, shock, like an exogenous shock to African economies, socially. And a lot of the kind of space that African finance ministers had to operate just was very, very limited because of the debt dynamics, because of World Bank, IMF rules. I think advanced economies launched a fiscal stimulus equivalent of like 18% of GDP, and low-income countries could only muster about 2% because they just didn't have the fiscal space. So I think we need to kind of look at those issues where Europe and Africa could work together, particularly on technical regulations like the Basel III framework, which was brought in to protect the banking system after the financial crisis. But actually some of those rules inhibit investors investing in emerging markets. So we could just tweak those rules by working together, bring down the costs, and that could be a fundamental driver of mutual benefit for both continents.
Perhaps also just to add one more thing as well, there's a huge obstacle in the form of perception that exists probably across Central Eastern Europe as well, but definitely within Africa. There was a tech startup that I was working with that was registered and headquartered in Nigeria, but because of the perception around Nigeria as an ecosystem as a country, it was unable to secure any international global contracts. It literally had to move its registration and register in Delaware and become an American company, and same people, same business model, same everything, and suddenly a world of opportunities opened up. Nothing changed except just the public perception or external perception of a country where a lot of people know very little about in reality. And there were sightings of fears or insecurities around fraud, etc. I can tell from research that some of the worst sort of fraud offenses are way outside of Africa, actually, but no one pays attention to that because it's a sort of media perception of what these economies are, and that already sort of creates a mental sort of social barrier to opportunities that we could be working on more effectively across the continent and outside.
And just on that, there's a group called Africa No Filter that last year published a really excellent report. They're actually doing some events on it this week at the Africa Collective. But basically, they looked at an analysis of international media reporting of Africa and found that the vast majority was coverage of elections, and particularly pre- and post-election violence. And that shapes the international perception. And they actually did an analysis of how much that costs in terms of the increased cost of capital. And it was in... I forget the numbers, so I won't quote them, but it was pretty significant. So I would check out that report, Africa No Filter, because these things seem like they're kind of like soft, intangible things, but they have very serious impacts on the investment environment.
It's also an opportunity, I gather, from a culture perspective in terms of how do we bring in culture to sort of build our own narratives around that, as opposed to it being defined by sources outside of these ecosystems. So it's, again, challenge, but an opportunity within that to build on more of the cultural elements to narration, or at least storytelling around Africa.
Well, yeah, let me just add, there will be one more discussion here in Polish Business Hub tomorrow concerning stereotypes, misperceptions, CEE and Poland and Africa, which is very important. Well, frankly, we do not know each other, simply. I'm afraid, because there are many opportunities, many similarities. Of course, this collaboration, it's not easy task, really. But there's, I think, one fundamental problem. We do not know each other. But well, this is, we are meeting here in Polish Business Hub. So what to do to move forward? What are recommendations for governments, maybe for private sectors or for others? What to do to move?
Indeed, I think it's very important to sort of stimulate this process of getting to know each other, and that could be done in a variety of ways. Certainly, business delegations could be one way of approaching this. Business delegations which would focus on specific opportunities for collaboration across various African economies. So that could be one opportunity and one way of approaching this when it comes to business opportunities and a strengthened business collaboration between the two regions. I wanted to mention another one, but I think I got distracted, so let me come back later.
Okay. And what is your?
I would really love to see a lot more activity, sort of like in the tech innovation. I think some of the most creative minds are spread between these two regions. And I'd love to see them coming together more to solve for social, structural, political issues, and just share different perspectives. I think there's so much power in the differences we all keep highlighting, in how do we bring them together to harness sort of new perspectives and new insights across the region. So I'd love to see a lot more sort of innovation hubs cross-pollinating between those two regions.
I would say three things. So the G20 should tackle this cost of capital issue and make it cheaper to invest. Governments, particularly the European Union, should tackle the visa issue and make it easier for people to travel. And then thirdly, this perception issue. We should bring together the media to educate them, but also to kind of shift the incentives for the kinds of reporting that happens internationally about Africa. And of course, the whole media landscape is changing anyway, so there's a whole social element to that. But if we were to do those three things, which I think are kind of quite doable, even in this volatile geopolitical environment, it would really change the landscape. To me, it's low-hanging fruit. It's a no-brainer.
And perhaps you would like something to add?
Yes, it finally came back to me. Thank you. No, so related to cost of capital and the business opportunities, one example and one way of going about this could be also for governments across CEE, and Poland is actually an example of such a government. Would be to extend loans, low interest loans, to governments, African governments, for investments in particular areas, in particular sectors and subsectors. So very much sort of targeted lending that brings down the cost of capital, but it could also be an opportunity for business collaboration between. The case that I'm currently thinking about was it was 3 loans which were extended by the Polish government to Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania to boost their agricultural sector. As it usually is, it did have some strings attached in the sense that a portion of those loans had to be used to import technology from Poland, which obviously was the case, but that also one brings down the cost of capital for development, and two brings closer together Polish businesses and their counterparts in those 3 particular countries. So that could be another way of going about this, and I think that is quite beneficial both for the African governments, which benefit from low interest loans, as well as the business actors.
Thank you. Let me ask our audience if you have any questions. It's time that you may ask them. Yeah?
question to you is, what can private sector do to bring more voices together? How do we do this? How do we unite? Because we've seen the governments come together sometimes organizing the business trips and so on. They don't work. We've not seen enough of kind of vitality in that. So what can private sector do? How do we do that? How do we bring it together? How do we create new opportunities for collaboration between those two regions? Huge issues, but yeah, big question.
Please.
Well, I think the first step is the perception issue. The co-founder of my organization, Bono, often says, culture is upstream of politics and business. And if you can make things cool by promoting those cultural collaborations, like why don't we know more about the Ukrainian rapper rapping over Afrobeats?
I want to know more.
Yeah. I mean, there are millions of those examples, and we need to find ways of raising the profile of doing so. And that could be through simple things like social influencers. It could be convening media leaders to kind of say, can we tackle this perception problem? But also it's can we just bring artists with a megaphone together with artists from other regions? I mean, there are artists that are doing this already. Recently, Coldplay played in Dublin, where I live, and they brought together African artists, and there was it was a real melting pot. And I think that kind of sharing the stage, passing the mic, is a really powerful thing. And I wish more global artists would do that, or even just anyone with a global stage, because I think that it seems, as I said before, it seems like a soft, maybe not that significant thing, but actually, if culture is upstream of politics and investment, then that's what will change the perception and change the landscape.
Maybe to address it from a more of a tech and innovation perspective, maybe about a decade ago, I was in Egypt for the first time, and I was literally blown away by how much we were solving for exactly the same thing. But all this time, even though we're all African countries, right, you always almost see there's a bit of a divide in terms of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and you assume that these economies are just so vastly different that there's absolutely no room or opportunity for any sort of collaboration, different languages, different cultures, different everything. And I was like, hang on, we literally saw that there was a Tunisian company that was trying to do something in mobile money. And they came to me and I was like, oh, we're really struggling because we're trying to find examples of mobile money that we can sort of replicate in Tunisia and solve for some of the structural financial gaps or opportunities there. And this young man had never heard of M-Pesa in Kenya. And I was like, where are you looking again? And I was like, this is used all across Africa, but he had no idea, right? And I think the challenge is awareness. Right? There isn't enough knowledge and information sharing. The solutions to the problems that we're solving for are often right in front of us, but we assume that they're so far beyond our reach that we don't actually look for them, right? And so there's a lot of work to be done through media, through some of these influences, the cultural initiatives, to build a greater awareness of how, we can be solving for the same thing, and how sometimes the solutions already exist just next door. And you're just not aware of it. So I think there's a lot of we can do around building awareness. I think this gathering of people, small as it may be, right, I think is already a step in that direction, and is already, for me, in the few minutes that I've been here, has already brought so much more learning and exposure than an hour ago before I got here, right? So there's definitely room to have more of these sort of gatherings, more of these opportunities to collaborate and share.
It seems to be essential to build awareness, as you mentioned. And?
Yes, maybe one thing that I'd like to add on this one, on building awareness and sort of getting to know each other's cultures. I think that the Europeans, we know we are very much familiar with an EU-wide university exchange program, which is called Erasmus. I think it's a very useful program and truly beneficial to Europeans because through those university exchanges we have learned other cultures across the EU, and I think that considering introducing or creating a similar program between the EU, or the CEE indeed, and African countries, a similar sort of university exchange program could also contribute to a better understanding of each other's cultures.
Thank you. And more questions? Yes, we have some, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for such a meaningful conversation. I think it's more a remark than a question, but for me, it's really around, you mentioned the political unrest that occurs in some of the African countries. And I think we must not shy away from the fact that Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world, particularly South Africa. And I think that the conversation that we can add here is the idea of the fact that 60% of that youth population is actually employed by SMEs. So it's actually SMEs that are the enabler for the economy. And it's around what strategies can you guys think about that will enable the entrepreneurial landscape for Africa?
Yeah. Anyone? It's a difficult question. Or?
Well, I think it's a very good point that you're raising about enabling entrepreneurs across Africa. I think one of the biggest challenges that African SMEs face truly almost anywhere in Africa is access to capital and cost of capital. This is something that is recognized by SMEs across pretty much the entire continent. Now, cost of capital is really a function of risk, perceived or actual risk. And as it happens in many cases in Africa, it is a function of perceived risk, not actual, not accurately estimated risk. Agriculture is a case in point. Agriculture is perceived as an extremely risky industry with many players. It's very fragmented. There is little data and little understanding about agricultural business models, be it logistics, be it processing, be it input suppliers. And so one way of addressing the issue, this major issue that SMEs are facing in Africa is also educating the financial sector, working with the financial sector and strengthen their knowledge and understanding of certain sectors. Because if they can understand a certain sector, they can accurately or more accurately estimate the risk, and therefore they will put a different price on the capital. So this is one way of addressing the issue of very high cost of capital that we have in Africa today. There are also other ways of going about this, more sort of heavy-handed and sort of regulatory in nature. But I think working with the private sector, with the financial sector, educating them about the risk would be one step in the right direction.
Another possibility of looking at this is when you look at the investment landscape in Africa, the last couple of years were dominated by America and Western Europe in terms of investments coming into Africa. Over the last year or two, that has all but dried up. A lot of these investors have pulled out of the region. But what is interesting is that coming in place of that is a lot more interest from the East. So a lot of the Gulf countries, Japan is becoming a massive investor into sort of tech and startup ecosystem, as well as sort of the SME space in terms of small businesses. If you look at Japan specifically, they're more long-term investors. So the SME space is an area that they absolutely love from that perspective. And within that is an opportunity, and I've seen sort of the beginnings of this start to form, an opportunity for some of the more Central Eastern European countries to also play a role and participate in this opportunity, in essence, that has been left behind, because the perception thing has been a huge factor around why you're seeing a lot of this capital drying up. But the reality is that the potential that exists within Africa that is being unlocked every day is beyond our wildest imaginations, right? There is such an incredible layer of talent that is building. There is definitely gaps from an infrastructure, policy, and regulatory perspective, but the ambition levels and just the sheer resilience, really, of Africans when it comes to solving fundamental problems is one of the things that makes me question, in essence, why you don't see a lot more investment pouring into this region. And it's an opportunity that I think, for the most part, a lot of people are almost sleeping on. And so it's another point of collaboration between these two regions, because, and I've seen it start to happen actually, where there's a lot more activity coming into from the Eastern European blocs to come and invest in and across Africa, which definitely plays into the landscape you're talking about from a SMME and startup perspective.
Yeah, anything to add, or next question?
Just
Yeah,
I would agree
please.
with both those things, and we're working actively on them. I'd say the other thing is, the fragmentation of the trade landscape. There is this ambition around the continental free trade area, but the implementation of that has been really, there's a lot to do there, but more access to market. But then I think the other thing is energy. There are 600 million people on the continent without access to modern energy, and I think, we recently did a survey of tech entrepreneurs in Lagos, and the number one issue that they faced was that 3-4 hours a day they just don't have access to power. The World Bank is doing something about this. Actually, next week in Tanzania, they're hosting this summit called the M300 Summit, and the idea is to reduce that 600 million people without access to energy in half. So provide 300 million people with energy. And I think there's a lot that could be done there in terms of countries will bring forward plans. They'll draw on World Bank finance, but there's a need for private investors to come there as well. And that's also a market opportunity as well as a kind of fundamental barrier to SME growth.
Thank you. And
I will. Thank you. I will have to run, sadly, but I think an optimistic thing I would like to say at the end about collaboration. Collaboration does not start at university or at Erasmus. From my small town, hometown, and it is very, very, very small in Poland. It's called Koluszki. It is quite small. We have, in my home primary school, there is a collaboration between our primary school and a primary school in Kenya. And the kids are learning Swahili, the Polish kids, and the Kenyans are learning Polish. And they meet up every 2 weeks and they share their lives. They meet up, via Zoom call or something. And I find it so nice. All of them are super happy to meet each other. They form friendships. So I think that we have to think even bigger, not only students. I'm a student. Let the collaboration start earlier. Thank you.
well, great example. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm coming from the European Space Agency. I'll be on the panel here later this week. But I really, really wanted to come to this panel because I was really curious what you're going to say about the opportunities for collaboration between Central and Eastern Europe and Africa. And the reason why I'm interested in this is because I spent the majority of my career actually working on enabling technology collaboration, collaboration in space technologies, bridging Europe and Africa. And I can tell you what I noticed so far is that the majority of the programs which are being built in Europe, either through my organization or through European Union, are actually today consisting of the Western European countries that are able to either transfer the technology or build good capacity programs, also build markets and also treat Africa as export markets for their products. So what I'm trying to say is that for the first time in really maybe a decade, I can see right now a moment when there is an opportunity also for Central Eastern European countries to take part in those collaborations developed on the regional European and African level. And one example of that is information technology and artificial intelligence. So, for example, in Poland, there is the biggest database of Earth observation data, which is being used for digital agriculture, climate change, or climate adaptation studies, and so on. And we can see a large number of IT technologies and IT companies that are making a very successful private sector collaborations with African countries, bringing these solutions and actually building these solutions or those data centers and databases in African continent. So my question is, what do you think? Where's the limit? Is sky the limit? Can we actually look as far as the highest technology sectors, such as artificial intelligence and even space technologies, as opportunities for collaboration between these countries?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I mean, looking at some of the innovations that we have seen coming out of Africa, I would say technology is certainly one of the areas where this collaboration could be very successful. I mean, you mentioned M-Pesa in Kenya, mobile money. That is the place. Kenya is the place where it was pioneered. It was one of the telecom operators, Safaricom, that developed that service based entirely on the mobile network, which was addressing the unbankable and unbanked people of Kenya who do not have access to bank accounts. All of a sudden, they could use their mobile phones to transfer money, to receive money. And that was at the time a technologically advanced innovation which relied on technology. So I would say that technology is certainly one of those areas where collaboration between these two regions could be successful.
I think maybe one of the more interesting examples that speak to actually direct collaboration, so to speak. I'm sure you've all heard of TransferWise. Now, Wise also coming out of it's Estonia, right? Yes, I think. The model for TransferWise actually comes from this ancient model in West Africa. I forget the name, it slips my mind now, where basically instead of actually transferring money across sort of like diaspora and communities that had traveled, they would do each other favors. So if I needed to send $1,000 to the other side of the country even, or the continent, instead of moving that money physically, it's that system connects me to someone on the other side who needs something worth $1,000 to be done where I am. So I would maybe pay for school fees here, and they would pay for my thing there and on the other side, and no money is ever actually moved. And that's the model on which TransferWise was built on. And when you look at sort of collaboration opportunities like that, I mean, to answer your question, I think that the sky, there's no limit, right? It's such a tiny idea that you don't even pay a lot of attention to. But when you sort of backdate the historical sort of context of where that comes from, it already exists from that collaboration opportunities. And there is very much a role, I think, for Central Eastern European countries to come and participate in the innovation that is happening across Africa and vice versa. So the opportunity that you speak about, it's limitless, really. There's so much that is yet to be done. I think we're really just only scratching the surface in terms of potential, in terms of solutions, in terms of really digging into some of these problem statements that we're solving for. And I think the ability to be able to understand that in isolation, as opposed to just like, oh, I have no idea what's going on there, really just trying to understand like what is the problem that we're solving for, and can what I'm doing over here solve for this problem that's happening way over there? Often the answer is yes, right? I think often the answer is definitely yes, if you are able to open yourself up to that opportunity and move beyond some of the perception of friction that we have in that sense.
Thank you. So one more question, yeah? If we have, yeah, we have.
Hi, thank you. I've been following the conversation quite curiously to hear. I mean, it's quite interesting, and I love the connection between Eastern Europe and Africa. So I just wanted to double down on the perception question, yeah? because we talk a lot about it and we don't do anything about it most of the time. And let's see, if you're to live here with a practical, one or two key practical areas that can be pursued, what would they be? So you talked about culture. So I wanted to push the conversation beyond culture, because as a Kenyan, I'm always saying, oh, you're a Kenyan, you run. Oh, you're Kenyan, you have great safari. And people don't see, even with our M-Pesa, people never see beyond the running and the great safari, yeah. So while culture is great, how do I convince them that we have great techpreneurs? How do we convince them that we have great tech talent? What is that tipping point to convince that, talent is actually equally distributed? And to your question about space agency, I have 2 startups that we are working with. They're looking for space data. We'll talk.
Thank you for this comment. So, if you have anything to add, is the best moment.
I would definitely say there is, I wouldn't say that there's nothing that's being done in that regard. I think there's a lot of initiatives that are already in place. I think some of them you've also mentioned in terms of media that is working very hard to transform that narrative. But one of the best ways to actually sort of tell that narrative is get founders and companies that are bred out of Kenya, for instance, to aim beyond just Kenya, right? To solve for issues and challenges, because again, to the point of how problem statements are sort of interoperable in that sense, right? They move across borders. And so why are Kenyan companies feeling, or Kenyan founders, why do they often feel restricted to solve for Kenyan problems? Whereas you don't find that same restriction, definitely not from Americans, right, who are in every part of the world solving everyone else's problems. Why aren't Kenyan founders going out to solve problems that they see inherently either similar or have solutions to in that regard? So I think the best way to transform that narrative is to showcase. There are a lot of success stories in Africa across many countries of brilliant founders who have done brilliant things, right? The best way is to put them on that global platform, put them in a stage. I remember, maybe just as an analogy, I was hosting a conference a couple of years ago, and it was around International Women's Month. And there was this huge push to be like, oh, you should have a women's panel in this conference. And I was like, why? It's like, no, but to highlight the strength of women. So what they wanted to do was have everything else, all male in essence, and then have the singular woman-female panel to then showcase how we're supporting International Women's Month. And I'm like, the way that we support that is having women across all those panels, not just in one single platform to be able to voice that. So in terms of having that showcased, or that talent showcased across the world, it's not just about having a forum only for African founders. I think that's highly important to have a space, but I think it is finding ways of integrating them onto the global platform, onto the global stage, so people can see, hey, these are people that are solving for massive problems, right? Far beyond, I always say that African founders are the difference between that and a lot of what I see in Europe from an investment perspective is that we're solving for real problems, fundamental problems. If I am opening a neobank in Kenya, it is oftentimes giving someone access to the financial service ecosystem for the very first time. It's the first time that they've ever had an account. It's the first time that they've ever been able to transfer money. Whereas another neobank in most of Europe is really solving more for sort of user interface, I say. How to make that button look prettier, or, something that's already been solved for, and incremental solutions in that case. But I do feel as well some of the work that you've mentioned, by is it one campaign in Africa, No Filter? Yes, I think those are two. I think I've come across No Filter. Forums we should leverage more on, right? I think the social media and the amplification of the voices, I think we're in a day and age where the technology and the media that we have available and accessible to us, we don't have to be journalists to be able to tell a story anymore, right? You can tell your story in the comfort of your own home, on your own platform. You can showcase it to the world beyond just sort of running and safari, and tell people. I think it starts with you as an individual before, you shift that responsibility to somebody else. It begins right here.
I have a very practical suggestion, which is why don't we identify like the top 100 opinion formers, be they screenwriters, editors in newspapers, news anchors, whatever that might be. Identify the audience, identify the top 100 opinion formers, and then over a period of time, take them all on a trip and actually just show them what's happening. A couple of years ago, I went with a journalist from the Economist to see a carbon and capture and storage factory just outside Nairobi. And the story that they told about what they're doing, I mean, the Rift Valley is the best place in the world to do this because of the basalt rock and the geothermal energy. And it was incredible. And this journalist went up, he wrote up an article on it. It got shared very, very widely. But why aren't we doing that on a very regular basis? And we could even just start small with that list of 100. Find funders that are willing to fund those trips, organize them, find the best stories, just connect the dots. And then hold those people to account for, you've seen what's actually happening here. How is your narrative changing? If we were to do that, I think over a 1 to 2 year period, we could see some tangible differences, and we could identify metrics to measure those differences, and show the return on investment from making that simple investment in showing serious people who've got big platforms what's actually happening.
Let me just add that in Poland, Kenya is very popular, and you are right, as a holiday destination, but it might be good beginning. We've got direct chartered flights, which is also important, and so on. So I believe there is potential, really, but still, we do not know each other. Okay, so it's time to finish. I thank you very much. You mentioned many opportunities, many obstacles, but so many benefits. So I hope that collaboration between CEE and Africa will develop. Just very, very brief conclusion. Maybe I will address it to European people that sometimes solution of your problem might be next door, and this door might be in Africa. Thank you very much. Thank you.